Hi, this is Matt at LSAT Lab, and today's lesson is on main point questions in the logical reasoning section. And they're not a very common question type. There's only 4% of all logical reasoning questions are main point questions, and it is one of the easier question types in general. That said, it's a very important one because if you can't find the conclusion, it's going to be really hard to take on any of the other question types. So in this lesson, we want to cover a few things. We want to cover how to spot a main point question, what's the approach you want to take when you're working on one, what are the different kinds of conclusions that you should be aware of so that you can help find the conclusion? And then what are the common trap answer patterns to be on the lookout for? We're going to start with how to spot a main point question. And it's actually pretty straightforward. In the question stem itself, you're looking for language like main conclusion, main point. In this case, which one of the following most accurately expresses the main conclusion of the argument? If you see main or primary conclusion, it means the same thing. Also, if you see the words the conclusion, which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion drawn in the argument? That's different than if they ask you for something that can be concluded from the information, or which one of the following is a conclusion that can be drawn. If you see the indefinite article, you're on a inference question, must be true. Which one of the following is a conclusion that can be drawn? If you see a definite article, the conclusion, you're on a main point. Other than that, you're looking for the main point or the primary point of the argument. So now that we know how to find a main point question, the next thing we need to do is talk about the process that you want to take when you're approaching one. Most of the other question types, anything in the assumption family, for example, you have to do a lot of work. You have to find the conclusion, you have to find the evidence, you have to evaluate the reasoning, anticipate an answer. There's just a lot of stuff that has to happen. Whereas on a main point question, it's actually pretty straightforward. All you have to do is find the conclusion and then anticipate that an answer will sound just like that, and then go look at the answer choices looking for that. Now, because they're testing your ability to find the main point, they're going to make it a little bit harder to find than they do, say, in a question where they're testing your ability to evaluate the reasoning. There's no evaluation of reasoning going on here. You don't have to worry about whether the argument is good or bad. You just don't care. All you need to do is find the conclusion and then think about what that's going to sound like in the answer choices and then look for it. So here's a question. Go ahead and give this one a try. When you think you've got an answer that you like, go ahead and hit play again, and we'll work it through together. All right, welcome back. So what we're told in the argument says that the operas composed by Bizet and Verdi are 19th century European creations, reflecting the attitudes and values in France and Italy at the end of that century. Several recent studies impugn these operas on the grounds that they reinforce in our society many stereotypes about women, but only a small minority of contemporary North Americans, namely opera lovers, have had any significant exposure to these works. So what's going on here? Well, we have an argument where the social critic is basically telling us what these recent studies have criticized these operas for doing. Like, several recent studies impugn, who knows what that word means, it just sounds bad, these operas on the grounds that they reinforce in our society many stereotypes about women. So some people are saying that these operas reinforce in our society many stereotypes about women. But only a small minority, see that but? That's a pivot towards the author's position. Now, the author doesn't go so far as actually saying that those studies are wrong or saying that the opposite of what they're asserting is true, but the author does go about, but only a small minority of contemporary North Americans, namely opera lovers, have had any significant exposure to these works. So it's a point against what those recent studies are impugning these operas for. So essentially what we want to do is look for the idea that those recent studies are wrong, that the operas of Bizet and Verdi do not reinforce in our society many stereotypes about women. So now that we know what we're looking for, we can go into the choices. Notice that in the question stem itself, it says, which one of the following most accurately expresses the conclusion that the social critic's argument as it is stated above is structured to establish? Meaning it actually hasn't been stated yet. It's been structured to establish this conclusion, but it hasn't been stated. An idea of an implicit conclusion is something that the LSAT test writer uses regularly on main point questions in order to make it harder for you to discover what's the main point. By not putting it there, it's harder to spot. And this happens very regularly when the author is attempting to refute an opposing position. Answer choice A says that Bizet and Verdi constructed images of women that have significantly influenced contemporary stereotypes. Wait a minute, the author just got done saying that it does not. That is what the studies are suggesting. So answer choice A is actually the opposite of the author's main point. This is the opposing point. Answer choice B says 19th century French and Italian images of women are quite different from contemporary North American images of women. That dichotomy, that comparison, that relationship is not actually expressed within the argument, so let's get rid of that. Answer choice C says the operas of Bizet and Verdi have not significantly contributed to stereotypical images of women in contemporary North America. That looks pretty good. Let's hold on to C. Answer choice D says that opera is not an important factor shaping social attitudes in contemporary North America. Well, that may be implied to a certain extent, but that seems to go a little bit further than the author is taking it. Opera itself is not an important factor. Well, the author was talking about the operas composed by Bizet and Verdi. So D, because it's talking about all of opera, is simply too strong. Answer choice E. People cannot be influenced by things they are not directly exposed to. Well, that may be an assumption underlying the author's argument, but it's not the author's main point. Let's get rid of it. And that leaves us with answer choice C as the right answer. So let's think about what's going on with this conclusion here. The conclusion is refuting a previously stated position. And the idea of a refutation is a really common way in which, on main point questions, arguments are structured to make it harder to spot the main point. You want to be on the lookout for the idea of the refutation of a previously stated position. And you also want to be very careful about the way in which that position is being refuted. Are they saying that it's absolutely false? Are they saying that it's been failed to be proven true? Are they saying that there isn't good support for it? What is the degree of the refutation beyond the fact that we're just refuting a point? All right, so let's look at another one. Here's an example. Go ahead and give this one a try. And when you're ready to work it through together, hit play again. All right, welcome back. So it says that sometimes it is advisable for a medical patient to seek a second opinion, but this process can be awkward for both the patient and the physicians, since the patient often worries that the first physician will be alienated. In addition, for the first physician, there's the issue of pride. A second opinion tacitly highlights a physician's fallibility, and the second physician is in the position of evaluating not only the patient's health, but also, inevitably and uncomfortably, a colleague's work. So what's going on here? We have, sometimes it is advisable for a medical patient to seek a second opinion, and then we get this pivot, but this process can be awkward for both the patient and the physicians. And then we see the word since. Since is an indicator word. It's a language cue that helps you identify both evidence and a conclusion. What comes after the word since is the evidence, and what comes before it, now in this case, is the conclusion. So looks like the conclusion of this argument is this process can be awkward for both the patient and the physicians. And then what comes after it is the evidence for why that's true. So now that we know what the conclusion is, we can go looking for it in the answer choices. Answer choice A says, because of the awkwardness involved, it is best for patients not to seek second opinions unless it is absolute. This is not supported by the information. This is simply not involved. This is not present in the argument. Answer choice B, in cases in which second opinions are necessary, the first physician often feels that his or her professional judgment is called into question. Yes, that's absolutely true, but that's not the main point of the passage. That's a point that supports the point that it's awkward to get a second opinion. So B simply represents a premise of the argument. Answer choice C says, the process of obtaining a second medical opinion can be awkward for those involved. Yet that sounds like a pretty good paraphrase of the main point of this argument. Let's hold on to C. Answer choice D says, physicians who are called upon to offer second opinions are always uncomfortable about evaluating the work of colleagues. Well, this may be stated a little forcefully, though it does say inevitably and uncomfortably. So yeah, this looks like a part of the evidence for the conclusion of the argument, but it's not the conclusion itself. This is another premise. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice E says, in many cases in which medical patients seek second opinions, they are concerned about offending the first physician. Again, this is something that was there. It says that the patient often worries that the first physician will be alienated. Yeah, so answer choice E is another premise. Let's get rid of it, and that leaves us with C as the right answer. So in this case, the way in which we found the conclusion is actually through a language cue. That word since is how we found the conclusion. And language cues are another common way in which you can find the conclusion. On main point questions, you can use a language cue to spot the conclusion, whether it be thus, therefore, since, words that organize arguments, words that imply conclusions, or words that imply evidence. You can use them to help you spot the conclusion. And on main point questions, 21% of the time, you can find the main point using a language cue. Now, here's another example. Go ahead and give this one a try, and we'll discuss it afterwards. All right, welcome back. So it says, some people like to have green carnations on St. Patrick's Day, but flowers that are naturally green are extremely rare. Notice that pivot, that word but. And we get thus, That's a conclusion indicator. It is very difficult for plant breeders to produce green carnations. Before St. Patrick's Day, then, it is wise for florists to stock up on white carnations, which are fairly inexpensive and quite easy to dye green. So we do have the language cue, thus, and it does imply that that is a conclusion, but in this argument, it's not the main conclusion. So you do want to be very careful about language cues on main point questions because they're used very frequently as a way to pull you away from the main point and get you to focus on another point, even though it's not the main point. So in this case, notice in the last sentence, before St. Patrick's Day, then, it is wise for florists to stock up on white carnations. There's something happening there that's very important. The last sentence is a recommendation, and recommendations have a very strong tendency to serve as conclusions of an argument. So while we do have that language cue in the middle, thus, we also have a recommendation at the very end, and it's the recommendation that's the main point. The thus, it is very difficult for plant breeders to produce green carnations, is actually part of the evidence for why florists should stock up on white carnations right before St. Patrick's Day. And that recommendation is the main point, so we can go looking for that in the answer choices. Answer choice A says, it is a good idea for florists to stock up on white carnations before St. Patrick's Day. That looks like a winner. Let's hold on to A. Answer choice B says, flowers that are naturally green are very rare, and that's true, but that's not the main point, that's just a premise. Answer choice C says, there are some people who like to have green carnations on St. Patrick's Day. And yeah, that's true, that's the first sentence of the argument. But that's not the main point, that's the evidence for why the florist should be stocking up on white carnations so that they can dye them green. So let's get rid of C. Answer choice D says, white carnations are fairly inexpensive and can easily be dyed. Again, true. That's the very end of the argument. But again, that's not the main point. That's another premise. Answer choice E, it is very difficult to breed green carnations. Now, that is the part that comes after the word thus. It is very difficult for plant breeders to produce green carnations. So while it's a conclusion, it's not the main conclusion. This is an intermediate conclusion. And that lets us choose answer choice A with confidence. And if we think about the role of this conclusion here, right, it's a recommendation. And recommendations are, again, another really important way in which you find conclusions in logical reasoning. 18% of the conclusions on main point questions are recommendations. So tuck that away in your hat and pull it out when you need it. But if you see the word should or ought, you should do this, you ought to do that, it's better to do this. A recommendation about what you should or ought to be doing is a really common way that they'll create a conclusion. All right, so let's look at another example, and let's see another type of conclusion. Go ahead and give this one a try, and when you're ready to discuss, hit play again. All right, so it says, gigantic passenger planes currently being developed will have enough space to hold shops and lounges in addition to passenger seating. However, the additional space will more likely be used for more passenger seating. The number of passengers flying in the air traffic system is expected to triple within 20 years. And it will be impossible for airports to accommodate enough normal-sized jet planes to carry that many passengers. All right, so they've got these new gigantic passenger planes coming. They could hold shops and lounges, and then you see that pivot. However, the additional space will more likely be used for more passenger seating. That's the conclusion of the argument, that it will more likely be used for passenger seating. And notice that sentence is a prediction about the future. Just like recommendations have a strong tendency to be conclusions, so do predictions. So if you see a prediction being made about the future based off of evidence that they see today or about the past, really consider that as being a contender for the main point. So we have the evidence, which is the number of passengers flying the air traffic system is expected to triple within 20 years. And it will be impossible for airports to accommodate enough normal-sized jet planes to carry that many passengers. If you're thinking about either of those two statements in the end, notice the word and there really makes it very difficult for either one of them to be the conclusion. The and is basically saying that these two things are in conjunction with each other, making it really difficult for one to be supporting the other, right? That makes it more likely that the prediction right before it is the main point. All right, so we're looking for in the answer choices, the additional space will more likely be used for more passenger seating. Answer choice A says, gigantic planes currently being developed will have enough space in them to hold shops and lounges as well as passenger seating. And while that's true, that's not the main point. In fact, that's the claim that the author thinks is not going to happen. Answer choice A says that gigantic planes currently being developed will have enough space in them to hold shops and lounges as well as passenger seating. Well, they could do that, right? And they will have that space. The author doesn't think that it's going to be used for that purpose, but they will have enough space to do that, right? That's a premise of this argument. Answer choice B says the additional space in the gigantic planes currently being developed is more likely to be filled with passenger seating than with shops and lounges. That looks exactly like the author's main point. Let's hold on to B. Answer choice C says the number of passengers flying in the air traffic system is expected to triple within 20 years. Again, that's a premise of this argument. Answer choice D says in 20 years, it will be impossible for airports to accommodate enough normal-sized planes to carry the number of passengers that are expected to be flying then. Well, yeah, that's true. They say that. So let's hold on to, let's get rid of D. Answer choice E. In 20 years, most airline passengers will be flying in gigantic passenger planes. Well, we don't actually know that. We do know that gigantic passenger planes are coming and that the number of passengers is expected to triple within the next 20 years. And that it's impossible for airports to accommodate enough normal-sized jet planes to carry that many passengers. But it could be a mix of gigantic passenger planes and normal passenger planes. And to say where the majority of passengers will be, which kind of plane, is simply unsupported by the argument here. So let's choose answer choice B. That's the right answer. So let's return back to the conclusion for one more second. The additional space will more likely be used for more passenger seating. All right, so remember, this conclusion was a prediction. And we said that predictions have a tendency to serve as conclusions. On main point questions, 12% of the conclusions are a prediction about the future. So keep in mind or listen for them making a prediction based off of current information or maybe even information that they've collected in the past. So here's another main point question. I think this is the last one for this lesson. Go ahead and give this one a try, and when you think you've got an answer, hit play, and we'll review it together. All right, welcome back. So it says each of many different human hormones can by itself raise the concentration of glucose in the blood. The reason for this is probably a metabolic quirk of the brain. To see this, consider that although most human cells can produce energy from fats and proteins, brain cells can use only glucose. Thus, if blood glucose levels fall too low, brain cells will rapidly starve, leading to unconsciousness and death. Now, that word thus at the very end of the argument is very tempting, but just because you see a thus or a therefore or hence doesn't mean that you're looking at the conclusion, the main conclusion of the argument. It is a conclusion, but not necessarily the main conclusion. And on main point questions, intermediate conclusions are a really common way in which they can try to pull you away from the main point and get you to think that something else might be what we're here for. In this case, this is actually a pretty clever argument. That first sentence sets out a phenomenon that we witness in the world. Each of many different human hormones can by itself raise the concentration of glucose in the blood. The really important language that follows that is the reason for this. So that second sentence represents an explanation for how or why that first sentence occurs. And then you see the language that follows the second sentence. It says to see this, consider that although, so basically everything that comes after that is the evidence for why theirs is the right explanation. So the main point of this argument is an explanation. The reason for this is probably a metabolic quirk of the brain. The claim at the very end, if blood glucose levels fall too low, brain cells will rapidly starve, leading to unconsciousness and death. That's an intermediate conclusion. Okay, so now that we know what the main point is, let's go ahead and find it. We're looking for the reason for this is probably a metabolic quirk of the brain. Answer choice A says, each of many different human hormones can by itself raise blood glucose levels. Well, that's the phenomenon. That's not the main point. Answer choice B says, the reason that many different hormones can independently raise blood glucose levels is probably a metabolic quirk of the brain. That looks like a pretty close paraphrase of the second sentence. Let's hold on to it. Answer choice C says, although most human cells can produce energy from fats and proteins, brain cells can produce energy only from glucose. Yeah, that's true. But that's not the main point. Answer choice C says, although most human cells can produce energy from fats and proteins, brain cells can produce energy only from glucose. Well, that's true, but that's too narrow to be the main point. That's a premise of this argument. Let's get rid of it. Answer choice D says, if blood glucose levels fall too low, then brain cells starve, resulting in loss of consciousness and death. That's the intermediate conclusion. Answer choice D. Answer choice E says, the reason brain cells starve if deprived of glucose is that they can produce energy only from glucose. Well, this isn't actually stated in the argument, but it is an assumption of the intermediate argument. So it's an assumption of the argument, but it's not stated, and it's definitely not the main point. Let's get rid of E, and that lets us choose B with confidence. And in this case, remember, the conclusion was an explanation of a phenomenon. And explanations, again, are important. 9% of main point questions, the conclusion is an explanation of something that was witnessed in the world. So be on the lookout for the idea of a claim that is seeking to give you the how or the why something else occurred. So now let's conduct just a review of the different conclusion types that you're going to likely face when you're working on main point questions. From the top right, 39% of main point questions are presenting a refutation of a previously stated position. 21% are ones where you can find the main point using a traditional language cue like thus or therefore or hence. 18% of main point questions have conclusions that serve as recommendations. 12% have conclusions that serve as a prediction, and 9% have conclusions that serve as an explanation. So these are some really frequent and common conclusion types that you should be on the lookout for. And if you're stuck and you start to think about these, it should help you find it. Now, the trap answers that you want to be on the lookout for, answer choices that are out of scope, are clearly wrong. But more likely, something that might be tempting but wrong is something that's stated within the argument but doesn't turn out to be the main point. And so those could be like a premise, it could be a claim that has been twisted around a little bit, it could be an assumption of the argument, it could be an opposing point or an intermediate conclusion. More tempting would be an answer choice that's either stated or assumed within the argument, meaning it's part of the argument in some way. Maybe it's an opposing point. So premises are the most common tempting but wrong answer on main point questions. So claims that are there but not the main point. Claims that maybe take a claim that was there and twist it, make it unsupported, are another common reason why an answer choice might be wrong. Assumptions are not actually stated in the argument, but because they're relevant to the argument, whether it's the main conclusion or an intermediate conclusion, because an assumption feels like it's getting you part of the way there, it might be tempting to a certain extent. Opposing points might be tempting because you might get flipped around in terms of not noticing that there's the author trying to refute this opposing point. Because it might be stated so forcefully or so strongly, it could start to sound like the main point. Intermediate conclusions are going to be very tempting as well because you might see that language cue, thus or therefore, introducing a claim, but that doesn't necessarily make it the main point. Answer choices that maybe take a claim and make it and rephrase it in a way that's stronger than was actually there could also be a tempting reason why an answer choice is wrong. And 9% of wrong answers are wrong on main point questions because they're too strong. So these are the traps that you really want to be on the lookout for. Think about the other roles that a claim can play within an argument. Those are going to be the ones that you really want to be paying attention to. The way you spot a main point question, remember, is you're looking for main conclusion or primary conclusion or the conclusion. The types of conclusions you want to be on the lookout for, the idea of a refutation or a language cue, and then recommendations, predictions, and explanations are really helpful when it comes to finding the main point on this question type. And then finally, the key trap answers to be paying attention to, essentially claims that play a role other than the main point will be tempting. So premises, out of scope won't be there. Unsupported will be a twist on a regular idea. Too strong will be a twist on a regular idea. Assumption being something that's going to help you get there. An opposing point will definitely be there, but it won't be the author's position. And then an intermediate conclusion will be tempting, but wrong. And it will probably be tempting because of the language cue, thus or therefore or hence. They'll give it to try to pull you away from the main point. So that's it for today's lesson on main point questions. I invite you to check out some of these other lessons or visit us today at lsatlab.com.